A 21-mile-wide strip of water between Iran and Oman controls whether billions of people eat. Most people think of the Strait of Hormuz as an oil corridor, a choke point for crude, the thing that moves gasoline prices. But here's what almost nobody talks about. 33% of all seaborne fertilizer trade passes through that same narrow channel, along with 45% of the world's traded urea, 18% of ammonia shipments, and 44% of the global sulfur supply. When crude oil gets disrupted, governments open up strategic petroleum reserves. The United States alone holds hundreds of millions of barrels. There are no strategic reserves for fertilizer. Not a single country on Earth stockpiles nitrogen or phosphate the way they stockpile oil. When that supply vanishes, it simply vanishes, and the crops that depend on it do not wait for diplomacy to catch up. 5 days that broke the supply chain. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated airstrike campaign targeting Iranian military installations and nuclear facilities. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. Within 72 hours, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, and that declaration set off one of the fastest supply chain collapses in modern agricultural history. The violence reached civilian shipping almost immediately. On March 1st, the commercial oil tanker Skylight took an unidentified projectile north of Oman, killing 2 Indian crew members and injuring 3 others. That single strike shattered any illusion of civilian maritime immunity, and what followed was not a military blockade in the traditional sense. It was an insurance blockade. Marine war risk premiums, which normally sit at a baseline of 0.25% of a vessel's replacement value, surged past 1% overnight. For a modern LNG carrier valued at $100 million, that translates to $1 million per single voyage in insurance alone. Guard, Skuld, North Standard, and the London P&I Club either cancelled policies outright or issued mandatory premium increases. And this is where it gets worse. Without valid war risk insurance, vessels cannot be legally chartered, and letters of credit cannot be cleared by any financial institution. The blockade did not need a physical wall of warships. It only needed enough risk to break the mathematics of maritime insurance. By March 2nd, between 158 and 170 container ships, representing up to 691,000 TEU of capacity, roughly 2.1% of the entire active global container ship fleet, sat trapped in the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, or inside the Persian Gulf. Shipping traffic through the strait dropped to near absolute zero. 2 days later, Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all shipments after Iranian drone strikes hit its Ras Laffan complex. This matters because Qatar Energy handles 20% of global LNG and approximately 11% of global urea exports, and that single declaration severed the contractual obligations of one of the world's most important fertilizer suppliers. On March 5th, the U.S. Department of Justice launched a sweeping antitrust investigation into Nutrien, Mosaic, CF Industries, Koch, and Yara over price-fixing allegations, which meant that even the major Western fertilizer companies now faced legal uncertainty on top of physical supply destruction. Thai domestic granular urea jumped to $535 per ton. U.S. Gulf Coast DAP climbed to $640 to $645 per short ton. The chemical chain reaction nobody saw coming. Modern high-yield agriculture is a mechanism for converting fossil fuels into human calories, and the 3 macronutrients that make it work, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, each depend on completely different supply chains that all converge at the same choke point. Nitrogen fertilizers like urea and ammonia are not mined from the earth. They are synthesized from atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen through the Haber-Bosch process, a century-old industrial method running almost entirely on natural gas as both chemical feedstock and thermal energy. Natural gas accounts for 70 to 90% of the marginal production cost of ammonia, and the Middle East accounts for roughly 45% of all global urea exports, with Qatar alone responsible for 11% of the global market. But here's the thing that most people miss entirely: sulfur. Approximately 44% of all globally traded sulfur transits the Strait of Hormuz. Sulfur is the irreplaceable chemical reagent required to convert raw phosphate rock into phosphoric acid, which then becomes the DAP and MAP fertilizers that farmers spread on fields worldwide. None of it is produced deliberately either. It comes out involuntarily as a byproduct of oil refining and natural gas processing. And because the Persian Gulf sits at the nucleus of global hydrocarbon processing, it dominates the sulfur trade. When the strait closed, it did not just block nitrogen, it simultaneously crippled phosphate production worldwide by cutting off the sulfur supply. Morocco's OCP group, which controls the vast majority of global phosphate rock reserves, relies on imported Middle Eastern sulfur to process those reserves into exportable fertilizer. OCP reported 114 billion Moroccan dirhams in 2025 revenue, but its operating expenses had already surged 15%, largely from sulfur price inflation, even before the Hormuz blockade landed. Nitrogen production halted, and phosphate processing starved of its chemical catalyst, both at the same time, creating a dual-vector crisis with no modern precedent. The farmer's impossible math. To understand why this matters for food, you need to understand one number. In early 2026, the urea to corn price ratio stood at 127.74, which means a farmer must harvest and sell nearly 128 bushels of corn just to purchase a single ton of urea. Back in 2022, when fertilizer prices also spiked, farmers could absorb the costs because grain prices were simultaneously at record highs. The shock hit both input costs and revenues, and margins survived. 2026 flipped that equation. Fertilizer prices are accelerating upward, while crop values are falling, with corn and soybean prices down more than 50% from their 2022 peaks. Farmers are being squeezed from both sides, and that inverted dynamic makes this moment uniquely dangerous. The biological consequences are just as severe. When fertilizer prices destroy profitability, farmers cut application rates, and a 20% reduction in nitrogen application causes a 14% yield decline in continuous corn rotations. Scale that up, and the projections turn alarming. A 50% shock to agricultural inputs could reduce global maize production by up to 26%, wheat by 21%, and rice by 27 to 29%, depending on the region. Cutting quantities is only half of the response. Confronted with prohibitive nitrogen costs, producers rotate away from maize and wheat toward nitrogen-fixing legumes like soybeans. In Ghana, during the 2022 price spike, 1 in every 5 farmers shifted from maize to soybeans. That sounds like smart adaptation, but the result was that it artificially tightened global corn and wheat supply while temporarily flooding soybean markets, creating secondary price shocks in both directions. North American phosphate application had already fallen 20% from normal baseline levels before the 2026 shock even began. Farmers were already mining the soil, drawing down nutrient reserves deposited in previous years, rather than buying new inputs, a practice that structurally degrades soil health and guarantees lower yields in future seasons. The credit crisis. Behind the fertilizer crisis, what is happening at the farm level is not just an agronomic problem. Total U.S. farm debt reached roughly $594 billion in 2025, with operating loan volumes surging more than 30% in consecutive quarters. None of that borrowing went toward expansion or modernization. Producers were financing basic seed to harvest survival and rolling over unpaid debt from previous unprofitable seasons. Interest expenses climbed 73% between 2020 and 2025, with agricultural operating loan rates hovering between 7.5 and 8%. Chapter 12. Family farm bankruptcies increased 55% in 2024, then jumped another 46% to 315 filings in 2025. The Chicago Fed's Ag Letter shows a strong negative correlation of negative 0.80 between farm working capital and loan repayment failures, which means as capital drops, repayment failures spike almost perfectly in tandem. Without immediate margin relief, lenders project forced sales and liquidations of farm assets to continue rising sharply. Who gets hit hardest? A global vulnerability map. The pain from this crisis falls hardest on the nations least equipped to absorb it, and a global fertilizer vulnerability index tracking 6 pillars: import dependency, supplier concentration, foreign exchange reserves, fiscal space, logistics resilience, and farmer purchasing power, exposes exactly where the damage concentrates. Ethiopia's agricultural sector employs 85% of the population. During the 2021 to 2022 shock, domestic fertilizer prices skyrocketed 170%. The country holds only 1.7 months of import cover in foreign exchange. The gap between the official exchange rate and the black market rate exceeds 36 birr per dollar. And in late 2025, the National Bank of Ethiopia allocated $1 billion in scarce reserves, specifically to settle fertilizer import bills. Pakistan holds only 3.4 months of import cover and relies on imported LNG to power its domestic urea manufacturing. Any Hormuz disruption simultaneously chokes its energy supply and its agricultural inputs. Over 7 million Pakistanis already face severe food insecurity. Across sub-Saharan Africa, the crisis runs deeper. African farmers already lose an estimated 40 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium annually because they cannot afford to replace what the soil gives up. Over 70% of Africa's arable land suffers from poor fertility, acidity, or critically low organic matter. When global prices spike, smallholder farmers are entirely priced out of the market. Brazil, the world's largest fertilizer importer, sources approximately 65% of its total demand internationally. Brazilian soybean operating margins are projected to plummet 35.6% in the 2025/2026 season. Farmers there have already started substituting expensive granular urea with less efficient ammonium sulfate and replacing high-grade phosphates with lower concentration single superphosphate just to stay solvent. India imports 20 to 21 million tons of fertilizer annually and is acutely exposed to Hormuz for its urea and DAP. The Indian government recently allocated 372.16 billion rupees, roughly $4.35 billion, specifically to absorb the shock. But under a prolonged blockade, the sovereign fiscal capacity to maintain that subsidy faces severe testing. The food price transmission. Who pays at the grocery store? Here is a counterintuitive finding. In wealthy countries, fertilizer shocks barely register at the supermarket. The farm share of the final consumer food dollar in the United States has fallen below 20%, and the raw wheat in a loaf of bread accounts for under 8% of the retail price. Processing, transportation, packaging, marketing, and retail margins absorb the volatility. In developing countries, the math flips completely. The farm share of the final food price can reach 42% for cereals and up to 88% for animal proteins. When fertilizer costs spike in these markets, there is no buffer, and retail food prices rise almost one-for-one with producer costs. Predictive models bear that out with severe numbers. Under a major supply shock, localized food inflation could reach 55.9% in Iran, 33.2% in Argentina, 21.2% in Malawi, and 17.1% in Nigeria. Cumulative consumer inflation since 2020 has already reached 116% in Egypt, 464% in Turkey, and 2,614% in Argentina. Every 1% increase in global food prices forces an estimated 10 million more people into extreme poverty. 3 scenarios for the next 2 years. The trajectory from here depends entirely on what happens at the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts model 3 pathways. Scenario 1. De-escalation. Diplomatic intervention reopens the strait and normalizes Red Sea security. Urea drops from $596 per ton to around $440 to $460 within 12 months. The FAO Food Price Index eases toward 119. China gradually relaxes export quotas. New production capacity comes online, and the global system stabilizes. Scenario 2. Prolonged tension. The strait stays technically open, but subject to drone strikes, electronic jamming, and sporadic vessel seizures, with war risk premiums holding above 1%. Urea sits at $600 to $650 per ton. the humanitarian funding gap grows from $6.5 billion to $8 billion, and corn yields drop 3 to 5% below baseline globally. Scenario 3. Total blockade. The Strait of Hormuz closes completely, and roughly 3 to 3.9 million tons of fertilizer shipments vanish from the global market per month, including 1.2 to 1.5 million tons of urea and 1.5 to 1.8 million tons of sulfur. European natural gas prices retest and potentially exceed the historic peaks of 2022. Crude oil surges above $130 per barrel, with models suggesting potential spikes up to $300. Urea prices could reach $1,000 to $1,300 per ton. The FAO Food Price Index climbs past 155. Global corn yields face 10 to 14% destruction. The WFP humanitarian funding gap explodes past $12 to $15 billion, far exceeding the capacity of the international system to respond. The 2008 food crisis was a demand shock. India doubled fertilizer imports, China banned exports, and speculation drove prices through the roof. The system corrected itself when demand collapsed. The 2021 to 2022 crisis was a supply shock. Sanctions and energy weaponization shuttered European ammonia plants and blocked Russian potash. And that corrected itself over 2 years as trade routes realigned and alternative suppliers scaled up. 2026 is different. This is a physical choke point blockade, coupled with the kinetic destruction of production infrastructure. It cannot be legislated away by adjusting tariffs, and product manufactured inside the Persian Gulf is geographically imprisoned. There is no alternative pipeline, no rail route, no workaround. The system was already fragile before the first missile struck. Global nitrogen use efficiency stands at only 46%. Meaning more than half of all applied synthetic nitrogen is lost to the environment. The global food import bill hovers near $2 trillion annually. 318 million people already face crisis levels of hunger. Precision agriculture could cut chemical input volumes by 20 to 30% while maintaining yields. Strategic nutrient reserves could absorb sudden supply shocks, the way petroleum reserves absorb oil shocks. The African Development Bank's fertilizer financing mechanism in Uganda deployed a $2 million credit guarantee that leveraged 15 times its value, distributing 60,000 metric tons of fertilizer to 400,000 smallholder farmers. Every dollar of development grant through the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program mobilized $6.30 from private investment. The tools exist. The financing models exist. What does not exist is the margin for error. The era of cheap, reliable, hyper-globalized agricultural inputs has fractured, and until the physical security of maritime choke points can be guaranteed, the global food system operates under a permanent risk premium, one where the heaviest burden falls, as it always does, on the people who can least afford it.